Welcome back, everybody. We are going to begin our afternoon program of our second day. And kicking us off is going to be Stephanie Lovett, who's going to talk to us about Alice's Adventures Underground, a Wonderment, with a lowercase u and under, I should point out. Stephanie is a holder of a PhD, a two-time past president of the Carroll Society of North America. Her publications include Lewis Carroll in Wonderland, The Art of Alice, and many articles and reviews. Her PhD is in the cultural foundations of education, and she's taught Latin, ethics, and world religions. And we are delighted for her to kick off our afternoon session today. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Hugh. Let me get my screen share here and give people something to look at besides me. Let's see. Hi, everybody. Linda asked me to present this essay that John Mintzeff asked me to write for the forthcoming bibliography he's doing of Alice in English language, following up on his multi-volume Alice in a World of Wonderlands that surveyed Alice in non-English languages that many of you remember from as being a big feature of the 2015 celebrations. I worked on that along with the master, Alan Tannenbaum, and it did eat up 3 years of my life, so I declined a similar role in the English language project, but I felt bad enough about that when he asked me to write an essay about Underground for that project. I sort of felt like I had to say yes. I was kind of perplexed though, because once I'd said yes, I didn't really know what I had to say about Underground besides retelling the tale of its origins. That, you know, we don't really need that, that's readily available. But as you all know, when you start digging into something, you discover that you have thoughts you didn't know you had. And so I'm really glad he asked me to do this. Some of you will find there's swaths of this talk that are things that you already know. And some of you will find this is all new to you. But, you know, that's always our LCSNA meeting situation. And I think it's a good one where folks who have more background will be able to contribute more to questions and answers and say things I didn't even know to say. And maybe folks from, you know, completely new folks will have questions that will really shake up thinking of people who thought they already knew. So I hope after this we'll have some good conversation about Underground and what it is. So this talk comes specifically, I wanted to preface it by making clear why I'm even doing this, specifically in the context of thinking about Underground in the world of bibliography. So that just means, what is this thing? You know, what is it and how do we describe it? The word wonder is missing from the title of Alice's Adventures Underground, the proto Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but there's no more apt starting place than to say both that it is a wonder and that we have to wonder what it is. Carroll enthusiasts are perhaps so accustomed to it that they assume they know, but what else is there quite like it? There's hardly an adequate term to describe it because the world of literature hasn't needed such a term. Although commonly referred to as the manuscript, Underground is really nothing of the sort. It is indeed a manuscript, simply in that it's a handwritten text. However, it is not the manuscript of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which is what people mean by calling it that. Carroll seems to have destroyed the drafts and working materials for Wonderland, so this is not the handwritten version of Alice in Wonderland that was sent to the publisher. There is no manuscript for Wonderland. We also, I think, go astray in bringing to Underground the usual connotations of a manuscript, because that usually implies not just a handwritten text, but the text of a work intended for publication. Perhaps even one that's messy and annotated, perhaps one of several that survive as an author moves through the process of developing a book, but one that an author prepares working towards publication. Manuscripts can delight and intrigue us as we look upon, for instance, Kerouac's scroll for On the Road at the New York Public Library, or a Dickens manuscript at the Morgan Library. Their in-progress quality, that sense of being behind the scenes, the insider thrill of a making of documentary. This is not the experience of Underground, which is a complete and finished text. If we're standing in the British Library and contemplating Alice's Adventures Underground, what then are we looking at? A unique book, handwritten, hand illustrated, hand bound, created by its author as a gift to his young friend, Alice Little. If this were the only place this book existed, we could define it as a fair copy of an early version of what became the published book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. At most, we might have a little debate over whether we could call it an artist book as well, a one-off book that's also an art object. We would not need to consider it in a bibliographical work on the English language publications of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, though, if this were the case, except maybe to lament that we have only this polished manuscript gift book as a window on the development of Wonderland, the actual published book. Alice's Adventures Underground does have a bibliography, though, and a publication history of its own. Its status as a privately done piece of writing is vastly complicated by the fact that we can hold it in our hands as a published book and have to understand that what we have and what we see in the underground bibliography is a published book that reproduces the fair copy of an earlier version of another book. This recursively Escher-like quality of Underground is an important part of appreciating it. And while Wonderland scholars and enthusiasts may regret that we have no actual manuscript material, we can be pleased that we have so widely available this improbable book, a way station to Wonderland, an artist book in its own right, a curiosity, a labor of love, a statement of self-confidence, a private endeavor that the author artist himself chose to share with us. The beginnings of Alice's Adventures Underground are an oft-told tale. The young Charles Dodson, brought up in the country as the ringleader of his 10 bright siblings, befriended the children of the Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, Henry George Little, where he was a student, the equivalent of a fellow at other colleges. He met them while trying out his new photography equipment and tutored the younger Henry Little in mathematics. Dodson and the children enjoyed many outings, tea parties, games and puzzles, photography sessions, and story times. On one particular day, July 4th, 1862, Dodson and his friend Canon Duckworth rode the three little children, Lorena, age 13, Alice, age 10, and Edith, age 8, up the river Isis and back on a picnic. And in the summer sunshine, he began a new story, sending a little girl with the same name as one of the sisters down a rabbit hole. In later years, the various principals retold and codified the story of the story, making a picturesque narrative out of their memories. But it does seem that Alice asked that this story be written down for her. Over the next 2.5 years, Dodson worked on what became Alice's Adventures Underground, incorporating storytelling from other occasions and from his labor at his desk, and eventually presented her with a little book, handwritten to look like printing and fully illustrated. Less than a year after he had begun work on it, Dodson, who in 1856 had chosen the pen name Lewis Carroll for his published poetry, was already reporting in his diary that the family of his friend George MacDonald, the fantasy writer, thought he had a publishable tale on his hands. And in the fall of 1863, he paid his first call on his eventual publisher, Alexander Macmillan. This is the point at which we truly wish we had genuine working manuscript material, because it seems that Underground and Wonderland had a more parallel gestation than the smoother version of the story implies. Carroll completed the Underground we can see today by late fall 1864, a year into his work on Wonderland, which came out in late 1865. And it's intriguing to imagine the process of perfecting Underground as a separate work and simultaneously developing it into Wonderland. Much of that time was spent on the illustrations for Underground, a crucial fact in thinking about who Carroll was and how he thought about himself. Like many a passionate lover of the arts, Carroll longed to express himself at the level of the artists he admired and despaired as he consistently fell short. For instance, not content to merely and constantly attend the theater, he He made friends with professional theater people, delighted in introducing young people to drama, and wrote about the role of theater in private and public life. His own attempts at writing for the stage, though, are melodramatic and sentimental, and the closest he got to being a real man of the theater was his involvement with the Saville Clark stage production of 1886 of Alice in Wonderland. Likewise, he attended art exhibitions throughout his life, bought fine art, made friends with notable artists of the day, sought instruction, art directed his books, and particularly in his later years went on many sketching outings. It would seem, though, that his abilities never matched the vision in his head, and his greatest success as an artist turned out instead to be his landmark work as a photographer. The amount of time he spent on his 37 drawings for Underground, the tutelage he received from John Ruskin at that time, and the care he put into integrating them into the story all indicate the passion of his efforts to be a real artist. An image that might capture for us his heartfelt efforts and what his critical sense told him about his limitations is that of the final page of Underground. The book ends with a lozenge-shaped portrait of Alice Little from a photograph of her taken by Carroll. It was not until 1977 that Morton Cohen was allowed to lift the photo and reveal the picture of Alice drawn by Carroll that lay underneath, a perfect embodiment of Carroll the photographer substituting for Carroll the draftsman as a visual artist. Many people are interested in Alice's Adventures Underground as evidence of the development of Wonderland, and it's common to read claims that the adaptation of the one to the other was a matter of removing personal references and private jokes and adding a few more generally amusing incidents to the story. For a more accurate understanding of the differences between the two works, you may refer to the Night Letter, the Journal of the Lewis Carroll Society of North America. In his article From Underground to Wonderland, first presented as a talk at the Houghton Library in April 2012, scholar Matt DeMacos details the elements that are present in each story, and with data and narrative clarifies what Carroll actually changed and left the same in the move from private story to published work, confounding the simplistic anecdotes prevalent about this. Suffice it at this point to note that Wonderland is almost twice as long as Underground, and the changes are complex and fascinating. Alice's Adventures Underground is included in a bibliography of English language Alice's, though, because of its life as a separately published book. It is possible that some enterprising 20th century person would have persuaded the British Library to sell a printed version of Underground. They decided to sell this, for instance. But marvelously, it was Carroll himself who instigated its publication in 1886. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland had enjoyed 2 decades of success, including a sequel, Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, in 1871. Published date 1872, 150 years ago. In 1885, Carroll wrote to Alice Little, now Mrs. Reginald Hargreaves, asking if he could borrow back her book, since he was supposing that the sales of the 2 books indicated a public interest in seeing the original. Not only did it occur to him to share the earlier version of his already popular story with the general public, but he wanted to publish it as a facsimile, not typeset, just as he wrote it with his own illustrations. Carroll may not have felt that he was able to render with the skill he hoped for, but clearly he felt confident enough in the overall charm of his work to issue a facsimile version. We can't ask Carroll what the success of the Alice books did to the life of this mathematician-logician and the career he thought he would have, but the fact that in his 50s, he took the initiative to put before the public the little book that he had hand-lettered and illustrated 2 decades earlier, plus the facts that he would very shortly go on to create the Nursery Alice and be closely involved in a West End stage production, gives us an idea of the self-image he had gained as a popular author with a public who wanted more Alice from him. The metamorphosis of Alice's Adventures Underground from unique handmade book to published work was not a trouble-free process. We know from a letter to Alice Hargreaves, now in the Berg collection at the New York Public Library, that he could not come to an agreement with the zincographer regarding who would handle the precious original, necessitating seeking out a different professional. This person, he reported, created excellent negatives, but getting the actual printing blocks from him was another matter. After having to prepay him and then spending some months on railway journeys, solicitors, and an appearance in court, Carroll finally got all the negatives and most of the blocks, and then had to pay a second time to get the remaining blocks made. It is most interesting to note, though, that this book, the first published edition of Alice's Adventures Underground, is not actually a completely perfect facsimile, allowing that the covers are different and in fact are uniform with the other Alice books, that the page numbers are typeset, and the color title page and chapter headings are printed in black, and that the author has written us a preface and an Easter and a Christmas greeting, and included a list of his other works. They're still within the portion of the book that is presented as a facsimile of the original, one significant and unmentioned change. He decided not to share with the larger world the photo or the drawing of the real Alice that he put on the last page. And so the published facsimile ends with the last line recopied by Carroll to close the gap between summer and days, and the end added where the photo had been. Alice's Adventures Underground continued to exist as just the actual handwritten book and its Macmillan doppelganger of 1886 for over 40 years, until the sale of the manuscript book in 1928 by Alice Hargreaves and the centenary of Carroll's birth in 1932 brought into being a very fine facsimile edition meant not, as Carroll's had been for the curious Alice fans, but for the connoisseur of quality books and literary history. Eldridge Johnson's 1936 facsimile might be seen as a signpost on the upward trajectory of the Alice books as important works for sophisticated literary collectors. Johnson, president of the Victor Talking Machine Company, was the purchaser via the broker ASW Rosenbach of the original manuscript when the widowed Mrs. Hargreaves sold it at auction. And he was actually able to bring the two back together for a day in 1932 when she visited the United States for the only time for the Carroll centenary celebrations at Columbia University. At this point in our narrative, we should bid farewell to the manuscript book itself and note that after Johnson's death in 1945, it was sold, brokered again by Rosenbach, to a group of Americans who returned it to the British people as an expression of thanks to a noble people who held Hitler at bay for a long period single-handed. Luther Evans, Librarian of Congress, escorted the little book to England and presented it to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who called this gift an unsullied and innocent act in a distracted and sinful world, a pure act of generosity. The manuscript book remains in the hands of the British Library, which has created a web exhibit of it, in which viewers can page through the whole book. It has traveled to America again, to the Morgan Library in 1982 in celebration of the 150th anniversary of Carroll's birth, and in 2015 in celebration of the 150th anniversary of the publication of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. As a published book, Alice's Adventures Underground came into its own in the 1960s, perhaps attributable in part to the publication in 1960 of the Annotated Alice, edited by Martin Gardner, often thought of as the dawn of the modern era in Carroll's scholarship and appreciation. People who had not thought much about the history or the cultural impact of the now century-old children's classic, remembered from their own youth and maybe from the Disney film, learned that there had been a charming earlier version illustrated by the author. Underground became available to one and all via two major facsimile editions. The very nice hardback from University Microfilms has the virtue of an all too brief introduction by Luther Evans, who might have told more of the story of the actual manuscript book. Like the Johnson facsimile, it includes both of the then known versions of the final line of the book, with the photo of Alice as it appears in the actual book and the version without it from the 1886 facsimile, but with no explanation of why there are two endings to the book. Dover Publications, notable for making literary classics widely available in inexpensive editions, released a softcover version on the right in this picture with an introduction by Martin Gardner that was picked up by other publishers in hardback as well. In the years since then, Alice's Adventures Underground has joined the other Alice books in critical and combined editions and in complete works collections, sometimes typeset, sometimes unillustrated, positioning it securely as part of the Carroll canon and not just a novelty. This is particularly interesting when we consider that other variants on Alice's Adventures in Wonderland do not enjoy this same status. The other version of Alice, authored by Carroll himself, simplified and in color, is titled The Nursery Alice. It's just as much from his hand and also contributes to our understanding of how he thought about the book and of his character as a storyteller to the young, yet it remains a curiosity, almost unknown to the general public. In the same vein, though not a Wonderland variant, Carroll's excised chapter of Through the Looking Glass, The Wasp in a Wig, also remains a novelty since its rediscovery and first publication in 1977. Yet Underground is easy to find as the third published but original Alice book, perhaps due in large part to the peculiar and delightful drawings that Carroll felt so ambivalent about. Although the text, both typeset and in facsimile, is now so available, Alice's Adventures Underground is such a bijou item with its meticulous hand-done replication of printing, Carroll's intriguing drawings, and its intimate connection to the actual origins of the story and the lives of Carroll and the Littles, that we continue to see special editions being crafted for collectors. The highly limited and boxed 1979 Genesis edition boasts a foreword by Philip Dodson Jakes, Carroll's great-nephew, amplifying the status of Underground as a route for us to bridge the gap between ourselves and that legendary golden afternoon when Carroll first began telling the tale. This edition is introduced by Morton Cohen, who met and interviewed many of Carroll's friends and who devoted so much of his career to an immersion in Carroll's life. A very different limited edition of Underground was published in 2000 by Cottage Classics. Startlingly, there's an illustration, here's the front cover. Startlingly, this is the first separate and typeset edition published with illustrations by someone other than Carroll himself. Even more surprisingly, it's illustrated by the Underground comics artist Kim Deitch. Mark Burstein's introduction elucidates this confluence of Underground Alice and Underground comics, a felicitous landmark in the cultural life of this book, and a further step for it away from its significance as primarily an entree into Carroll's working processes. Anniversaries have prompted two other particularly remarkable special editions. For the 150th anniversary of that golden afternoon in July 1862, Alan and Allison Tannenbaum published a true miniature edition, 1 inch tall, accurately reproducing the cover and interior of the manuscript book, including the final page, given once the drawing of Alice and once again with the photo, no doubt the most painstaking recreation of the actual manuscript book since the Johnson facsimile. I've got a ruler there for scale. Here's me for scale. Cobblestone Productions in Australia celebrated the 150th anniversary of Wonderland in 2015 by producing 2 deluxe editions of Underground, boxed with a booklet of essays and a glove for handling it, or perhaps for pretending to be a rabbit in search of lost gloves. So, from a bibliographic point of view, Alice's Adventures Underground has been a wonder of a book, a unique artist book that stands almost alone in also being a published work that is an earlier version of another published work. It's also, from a literary and artistic point of view, though, that scrutinizing Underground rewards scholar and amateur. And it also offers a particularly fine lens for seeing Lewis Carroll. The conventional anecdotes about the origins of Wonderland and a lightning stroke of inspired storytelling tend to create a popular image of Carroll as a peculiar elf of a man, a shy Don who happened to be visited by the muses one day. A different image emerges from a comparison of the delightful but thin Underground with the far greater literary achievements of Wonderland and Looking Glass. A vision of endless, thoughtful, and creative hours at his desk, a visible charm and whimsy arising from artfully concealed labor, as the Underground illustrations themselves embody. Understanding the Alice books as the result of craft and not just inspiration does not mean they aren't also works of genius. It elevates Lewis Carroll from a lucky eccentric to a gifted and world-renowned professional author. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that people have got some thoughts and ideas of, is there anything else like this? Are there other editions you'd like to mention? We can ask Alan to talk about that miniature edition. There are other notable editions, certainly, that are worth mentioning. And I hope to hear your thoughts. I think we've got a little extra time for that.
Yes, absolutely. Dieter, I don't know if you would like to elaborate on your comment about the letter.
Sorry, let me just get on. Well, yesterday when we talked about, I talked specifically about Alice Liddell, and that, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for her, and some people criticized her in 1928, when she sold her manuscript. But as we know, she had to do it for financial reasons, due to the impact that the First World War had on the house that she lived in. But when Carroll wrote to her in asking her to borrow it, she did write to her father to ask what was the right thing to do. And like I said, her letter did not survive. And I haven't, so far I know that's part, the quote I gave was what her father said. So it sounded as if she sent a rather flippant response to her father, you know, as if she was saying this man has sold already so many copies, but now he has the cheek to ask for his original manuscript again. That just came up to me. So I just wanted to comment on that. But in Carroll's defense, he did donate the profits from the facsimile sale, like I said, for children's hospitals. So
I do think the immodesty of the project is fascinating, as we all, you know, do what we can do to think about who Lewis Carroll was and what he was really, really like. And to put that work in front of everybody, not even typeset, I just think it's remarkable and needs to be remarked on more. So I'm remarking on it.
Do you think he donated the profits because of something happened with Alice, that his dealings with Alice, and maybe she expressed something, and so that's why he donated the profits? Or do you think he did that just on his own without knowing that Alice had some problems giving him the manuscript? No thoughts on the matter?
I don't. I bet somebody does. Mark Richards?
No, but he did write to Alice about it, and he proposed to her about donating it to children's hospitals, and she gave her full support for that. She only asked, like you said, Stephanie, she only asked him, please don't reproduce the photograph of me at the end.
It would have been hard for her to refuse once he said he would donate the profits to a children's hospital.
Well, I'm wondering, is he really showing her up for what she said to her father? Then he kind of, if he didn't know her attitude, he really shows her up, you know, by donating the profit.
I think you're being a little unfair to both of them.
I think, well, it must have been awkward given, you know, the friendship had broken off for so long.
Right.
And she was now a respectable married woman. And by that time, she was also a mother. So Carroll even joked to her and asked her, may I send a copy of the facsimile to your daughter, Alice? But Alice had 3 sons. She didn't have a daughter. And he even sent one to his greatest enemy, her mother. He also sent a copy of the facsimile to her mother.
Elizabeth, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks. We've got 4 or 5 copies of the Johnson facsimile at the Rosenbach, as well as correspondence about production of it. And what intrigues me about that is something that would probably not happen with any publishers today. It is the intent is to make it such a perfect facsimile. It says it contains no mention at all about the fact of its own production or even the fact that it is a facsimile. You look carefully and you can see that it's printed, but it includes a little extra sheet of paper that reproduces the final sentence as rewritten for the first published facsimile. It shows the facsimile, the final page as bound has the photograph, but it also includes a separate sheet of paper that has a little snippet of the rewritten final line for the facsimile. It's printed on a sheet that can be set behind the last page and then folded up over to cover and show it. But if you don't know anything about, if you know nothing about what it is or what it's supposed to be, you can't tell from the piece itself. There was apparently not even any accompanying text that was sent out with it. I don't know if any of the other more recent facsimiles have such a thing. I think by the time any of those were produced, it was more standard to send some indication along with it.
I would argue.
Here's the blank page, or the facsimile of the final page, which is loose in the Johnson volume. It's just kind of folded over the page in the back.
Right.
I'd argue that there is a manuscript page, at least one, that I included in my article. It's I don't think Carroll wrote a manuscript. I doubt there actually is a manuscript for Wonderland. I think he seemed to send it to the printer and had galleys made. He scratched up the galleys, added pages, and sent that, and had that galley, those pages set by the printer. Then he did it over again, right? And it kept on going that way.
That's what I think too.
Yeah, so he doesn't, there probably isn't like a chronological, manuscript. It's probably out of order how he worked on it, right? And we do have this one page where it's typeset by the printer, and it's not Wonderland, and it's not Underground. It's between the two. That's what's typed. And then he's writing in changes for Wonderland. And that's in the new Mark Bernstein annotated Alice. And you can see that. And so I don't really think there is a manuscript. I think there are just a bunch of those pages that are now lost. He didn't save it because it was just a bunch of scrap, I think.
I think that as he wrote a part, he would send it off to the Clarendon Press and have them put it in type for him. And then, as you say, he probably reviewed it, had it done again. And
that's how he seemed to work on all his books.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have a manuscript for Through the Looking Glass either, probably because he worked the same sort of way.
Well, and there have people talk about the loss of the manuscript record in the computer age, as if we used to have a complete record and suddenly we don't. There have always been people who, once they were through with something, they decided it wasn't part of it, it wasn't something they wanted, would throw it in the fire. There have always been people who kept everything, but there have always been people who wanted to get rid of everything. And nobody says, I'm going to write the manuscript of the great American novel. A manuscript is whether it's a literal handwritten manuscript, as librarians still talk about it, or a typescript from a typewriter, or printed proofs with or without alterations. Those are all means to an end. The end is to get the printed book into people's hands. Some people, some authors and some publishers are more interested in keeping those interim states as for their collecting value, but that's something that really, to begin with, in the earlier stages of publishing, wasn't a thing at all. When you get to the Romantic age and people are interested in relics of the author and something from the hand, they're more likely to be saved. But
sometimes they come late. You know, Arthur Conan Doyle realized pretty late that, you know, he should ask for his manuscripts back from the Strand. You know, he didn't give a hoot. You know, he just, for many decades, he just sends his manuscript and famous stories. And then one day he woke up and said, hey, you know, I want my manuscripts.
But it is wonderful to see the manuscript pages of people who have corrected. And, you know, you look at Joyce's Ulysses and it's just mind-blowing. So we wish we had that.
Yeah.
By the way, I have here, if anyone wants to work on Underground and Wonderland, I have this Excel spreadsheet that has the dates. Underground on one side, Wonderland on the other, and all the dates from the letters and diaries, and all in chronological order. And you can kind of see what Stephanie sort of alluded to, that it is kind of all mixed up in one. And there's little symbols, you know, if you want to look at the writing or how the illustrations were going. But and it includes other information outside of letters and the diaries too.
You go first.
You want it? I'll give it to you.
You should say what volume of the Night Letter that was in.
This?
Yeah.
Oh no,
that's different. Okay.
August. I mean, Andrew was putting it in the Night Letter in his own form. Yeah. And he was making so many mistakes. I couldn't take it anymore. Yeah. So we didn't do the second half.
I see.
And the first half has so many mistakes in it. I don't even look at it. We
won't sell that, right?
Stephanie showed part of that in her diagonal. It was part there, but don't go. That's many mistakes.
So when I was at Indiana University about 3 years ago, I found a Carroll manuscript there in the archives. I published a little article on it in the Book Collector. So it is quite unusual in that regard. It's a manuscript of a poem that he wrote to Enid Stevens as he was walking actually, he would call it, in the mountains. And so it's pretty much a mess, little scribbled bits of paper and everything, but it was quite amazing to find it.
Yeah.
Stephanie, did you see the question? Well, it may be speculation. Why do you think Carroll decided to publish Underground, and what was his chief motivation to make this private version public?
I don't have a thought on that other than just raising the question as I did. I think it's something remarkable that we don't talk about very much. I mean, I guess we just take it for granted because it's always been there, but what a remarkable thing to do. I can only imagine that, I mean, he does say something about the public's appetite for Alice's or something like that. Maybe someone else remembers the exact quote. I guess, 20 years of receiving letters from people demanding more, he finally thinks, well, I do have a thing that I could do, but that he didn't have it typeset. But, he was right. I don't know how many people of my acquaintance who are not Carroll people have gleefully told me that they have this. I have this book. It's in handwriting, and Carroll did the illustrations himself. I just love it. It's such a treasure. So maybe he was really right that people would see that as extremely special. A friend of mine who has no particular Carroll interest, but just likes sci-fi, fantasy, and literature in general, owns that really expensive edition that came with the glove that is an excruciatingly perfect facsimile. He just bought it because it was a beautiful literary item.
So what about the operetta? Do you think the operetta kind of encouraged him? It was at the same time. I don't forget. It was at the same time or before, a little after, right?
Yeah, but he didn't hear about the operetta till late August of '86. So I think that is later.
Oh, okay.
Well, when does the biscuit tin come in? That other famous piece of marketing. I think that's
it's a little later, isn't it?
That's a little later.
I think it's later.
So the facsimile is maybe the proto Alice merch.
I think he was very proud of his drawings, and his drawings had not seen the light of day yet, and so that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think yes, there was a hunger for more Alice, and here he had his original thoughts on it.
I think when he writes to Alice, doesn't he worry that the drawings are bad because he hasn't seen them in so many years?
He's also modest.
Ew.
I think that's a good
Or
point.
maybe
that he wanted to see his drawings and publish.
I think I can't recall. I think I read that there were some other facsimile books coming out at the same time.
Or maybe he tried to write a third Alice, but it didn't work.
Was it even possible to do such a book earlier? As it was technology an issue?
I think I think there's a little of that there. Yeah.
Elizabeth asked about other facsimiles and how they handle it. This is the 1985 Pavilion Books edition, published in association with the British Library. It's got an intro by Mary Jean St. Clair, Alice's granddaughter. It's quite a nice, handsome publication, but it in the back does something really interesting. It has a translucent page with the photo. My virtual background's messing me up here. With the photo, I'll just turn it off. With the photo at the bottom, let's get rid of that. With the photo at the bottom, and then you turn the translucent page to get the picture. So this is one I think of the more interesting facsimiles that I didn't include in that little essay, because I mean, the point of that wasn't an exhaustive survey of Alice Underground. It was just sort of high points and interesting trends. So this isn't one I didn't mention. I think is really interesting.
It's interesting to note that he also didn't quite know how to write fiction. You know, he doesn't use the right capitals and quotation marks and the he said. They're all changed. You know what I mean? He was kind of, it shows him a little bit of a novice in writing fiction anyway.
He also had a lot of opinions about how those things should be done, right? I mean, his eccentric contractions. I mean, he knew other people weren't doing that. It's just that he felt they should be done that way.
No, but he does he doesn't. I'm wondering if the typesetter, when he sent it in to be typeset, if they changed it or if he did, because almost every line, if you look at the differences, you know, it's a capital and a whatever, it's all different.
All right, well, thanks very much, Stephanie, for the presentation.